Hello, everyone. My name is Trina Shanks. I'm Director of Community Engagement at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. I'd like to welcome you all to this great session that we're going to be having with Ms. Tawana Petty in a few minutes. But first of all, since this time we're going to be offering continuing education units, I'm going to hand it over to Aaliyah to explain that process. Aaliyah?
Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's session. I just want to go over some quick housekeeping notes so everyone knows what they need to do in order to get CE today. So you should have first filled out the form saying that you would like CE so that we know we need to send you a survey at the end. So if you haven't done that, that should have been in the email that you received inviting you to the Zoom session. So please go back and do that if you've not yet done it. So we do ask that you stay for the duration of the presentation today, and we do ask that you participate in any polling or other question and answer that goes on. So there will also be a post-test following this session, and we will be distributing that post-test to anybody who has met the attendance requirements and who requested continuing education. If you are not interested in CE, none of this applies to you. You don't need to worry. You can just sit back and enjoy. But both Jacqueline from my office and myself will be on. So if you have questions, you can direct them to our office. I will be putting our contact information in the chat, and we will also reiterate this information in the chat. So if you need to review, you can look for it there. I think that that's it. So I'm going to pass it back to Trina to get us started today.
Thank you, Aaliyah. And for those of you who want CEUs, please follow those instructions. I'm going to go over the agenda quickly, but also wanted to say that these are trying times with the violence, the sickness, the injustice that's been happening locally and in the world, but also the response with the protest and the anti-racist organizing and the community power that's existed, that's been exhibited. So we're excited about the conversation today. So before I even go into the agenda, we'll take a moment of silence for us to think about all that's happening in the world and to prepare for this conversation. And with that, please, next slide for our agenda. So I'm going to introduce the Engage team that's been putting these calls on. We're going to have someone from the Undoing Racism group to talk about what their work is going to be in the school going forward, particularly since they had invited our guest speaker, Tawana Petty, to come a few months ago. And then, of course, we're going to have our wonderful presentation and then we're, from Tawana Petty, and then we're going to have questions from students of Common Roots and open it up to questions from the audience, as well as talk about what's going to be coming up in the next week on this session. So next slide, please. So our Engage team is really a diverse group of activists and social workers that have decades of community-based experience. So again, I'm Trina Shanks, Director of Community Engagement and Professor at the School of Social Work. Our team includes Aisha Ghazi, Fatima Salman, Sonia Harb, and we have a wonderful field intern, Jamie Simmons. And so our Engage team, if you're wondering what we do, at the School of Social Work, it's an initiative to promote student, faculty, and staff engagement in communities. We connect community groups to one another and to resources within the School of Social Work and occasionally to other partners. We aim to help groups actualize their vision and ideas through project support and development. We help implement special projects at times with communities. We also have groups that we convene that promote employment equity, equitable development, and capacity building. Most relevant to this conversation and what we've been doing for the last few weeks is we have a focus on racial equity and social justice. And even though the call today is going to be a special session when many, many people are participating, these calls will continue and we welcome anyone who's here to join us. Our email is listed here, School of Social Work Community Engagement at umich.edu. It's also going to be put in the chat. Our website, and where all of these Thursday calls and recordings and summaries are also noted as a website, and it's going to be put in the chat. So we hope that you will continue to engage with us, not just today, but going forward. Next slide. So now I'd like to introduce Lisa Fedina, who is one of the members of the Undoing Racism Workgroup, to talk a little bit about what their group has been doing and their plans for the coming year. So Lisa, I'm turning it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Trina. Hi, everybody. My name is Lisa Fedina. I'm an assistant professor here in the School of Social Work, and here on behalf of the Undoing Racism Workgroup in the School of Social Work. And just want to thank you again, Trina, and the rest of the Engaged team for this opportunity to co-sponsor this wonderful event with Ms. Tawana Petty. We're really excited to be able to engage in this conversation with everybody and continue building upon what we've learned from Ms. Petty in prior sessions and conversations with her over this past year. So just a little bit of background and history of the Undoing Racism work group in the School of Social Work. We are a community collective of staff and faculty. More recently in this past year, I have included students in this group and came together about a year and a half ago after folks had attended a series of workshops that the School of Social Work, as well as our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, had sponsored to community members in our school. And these workshops were offered by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. So these workshops were really focused on helping our members of our school community come to a common definition and come to a greater common understanding of racism and white supremacy, and begin to set into motion a more strong and proactive approach to anti-racist community organizing within our own school. So the Undoing Racism Workgroup, under the leadership of Professor Daisha Price here in the School of Social Work. There are other folks who are involved, and that includes myself, Associate Dean Lorraine Gutierrez, Professor Rich Tolman, and our Assistant DE&I Director, Lauren Davis. And over the past year, our work has really focused on building community in the School of Social Work and building relationships across students, staff, and faculty members, and really trying to create a space for our community members to engage in their own in personal journeys and internal work towards becoming anti-racist, and also to serve as a place for the external work. And much of our work over this past year has focused on identifying racist policies, procedures, and practices in our schools, in the School of Social Work, and how, as a group, we can support our community members in dismantling these practices. So today's session with Ms. Petty follows up on the conversations we've had with her. I think was in February that we hosted her talk. And we, as a group, the Undoing Racism group, had an opportunity to sit down with her. And so we really focused those conversations on, building relationships, how we can do that in our anti-racist organizing, and the challenges that come with building and holding people in relationships, building bond or engaging in community bonding and building trust, while also supporting and holding accountable our members of our community, and understanding individual and collective roles in upholding white supremacist practices here in the School of Social Work. So yesterday we had our meeting in June, our June meeting yesterday, and are currently planning our goals and activities for the upcoming year and still fleshing that out. But going forward, we see this group as a place to hold ourselves accountable for the things that we said we would do, and not that just we could do. And then also using our group as a mechanism to organize the organizing that's happening in the School of Social Work. Anti-racist organizing is happening and being led by many different staff, faculty, and students in various different spaces. And so we are hoping to kind of coordinate those efforts across all these different spaces so that we can build off of the work that we're doing together. So I'm happy to answer any questions, or folks can feel free to email me if you'd like to get involved in the Undoing Racism work group here.
Thank you, Lisa. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you, that for those of you who don't know her, Tawana Petty. She is a Detroit human rights activist, author of various books, including the one that's on the screen and that many of us at the school have, called Towards Humanity: Shifting the Culture of Anti-Racism Organizing. And she is here to share with us her thoughts on anti-racist organizing. So we look forward to hearing from you, and I turn it over to you, Ms. Petty.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for everyone who took time out of their day, their busy day, I might add, to join in on this discussion. Before we go into the talk, I'd like to get a sense of who is in the virtual room, right? So where are you coming from? What is your racial demographic? Where are you zooming in from? And so we have a poll that has been created. to offer up an opportunity to get a sense of who's joining us for this discussion. So we're going to give you an opportunity, a few minutes to chime in on that, and then give a display of who we're interacting with. So I want to have a discussion today with you all about moving from allyship to co-liberation. And actually, I'm going to take you a little bit further back before you even get to allyship, right? And so when I wrote the book Towards Humanity, I was entering it from a space of thinking of mostly the non-Black folks, particularly white people, that I engage with who have some kind of realization of either privilege or the system of white supremacy. And one of my late mentors has always taught me that you don't get stuck in old ideas. Grace Lee Boggs, she would say, you don't get stuck in old ideas. If your ideas are stuck, they are already dead. And so I've been doing a lot of soul searching, particularly in this movement moment, and thinking about how we move from solidarity all the way up the ladder towards co-liberation, because there's many tentacles of how we enter into the movement against anti-racism and the system of white supremacy, right? And in that soul searching, I discovered that this conversation has to be broadened, right? There has been a kind of an opportunity to escape undoing anti-Black racism within even anti-racist spaces. And so what I'm hoping that this discussion can do is kind of remove that cover that is often available for not just white spaces, but also POC spaces, people of color spaces, other non-Black spaces, because we're in a historic moment across the world where folks are united in saying that they defend Black bodies, that they are standing up in the defense of Black lives. And so how do we tap into this moment and move beyond solidarity? How do we tap into this moment and move beyond our righteous indignation? How do we tap into this moment and move towards co-liberation and undoing these systems systemically so that we do not find ourselves in this space in another 20, 30 years? Next slide, please. So Indigenous artist Lilla Watson had a quote. She said, "If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is tied up with mine, then let us work together." And that is what co-liberation is, right? Co-liberation moves us a little bit further beyond allyship and accomplice and co-conspirator, because it says that I cannot be liberated if you are not liberated. It is deeper than us joining together to even, I'd say, take down statues, right? Violent, racist statues. It is us moving deeper than, I would say, even renaming institutions, right? It is us saying that these technologies that are created won't be created. It is us tackling the very root of systems prior to them even being innovated and created. And so what I'm hoping that we can do in this discussion is start to think about root cause analysis on a deeper level, move beyond notions of solidarity symbolically, move beyond even tackling systems on surface levels, and really dig deep into how we can ask the questions before the systems are created. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about our entry points to the movement and our road towards co-liberation, right? And so anti-Black racism is a global phenomenon. I've over the last 10 years of my life, I've probably talked to 30,000 white people, specifically about anti-racism, right? About how folks identify as being privileged, their understanding of white supremacy, trying to figure out how to be in solidarity or in allyship with the movement. And over the last maybe 5 years, that discussion has broadened into people of color spaces and thinking about how then can other non-Black people also join into combating racism and dehumanization of Black bodies. And so what I've learned over that time is that solidarity is a lot of times confused with allyship, right? So solidarity is kind of like, hey, you know, actually I'm going to move to the next slide so that I can walk you through these different spaces. So solidarity is like, I am sorry that that happened to you. My heart is with you. I'm going to check in on you. How can I be a good friend, right? That's cool. That I think that that is a perfectly normal way to enter into the movement of anti-racism, right? Allyship is a little bit further. Allyship is like, you know, I understand how the system of white supremacy has contributed to what happened to you, and I recognize my privilege. And because I recognize my privilege, I'm going to speak up. Okay. I bolded privilege intentionally because I want to come back to that. Co-conspirator, and often also known as accomplice, is I understand how the system of white supremacy contributed to what happened to you. I recognize that my liberation is tied up with yours. I'm going to follow Black leadership and challenge these systems and structures with you. Like, I'm going to take down a Columbus statue. I'm going to take down a Confederate flag with you. I'm going to rename institutions with you. I'm going to get out into these streets and I'm going to say Black Lives Matter in neighborhoods where my life might be threatened for doing so. But co-liberation says that I'm going to learn from Black leadership, but you don't have to be present for me to be struggling against white supremacy. Now, I don't need Black people to lead me in order to challenge white supremacy. I'm going to tap into the legacy of non-Black anti-racists and abolitionists who challenge racist structures in their own families, in their careers, and in their communities. It is recognizing that the racial hierarchy myth is a myth. Racial hierarchy is a myth, and that there is no privilege in being tied to a history of white supremacy, racial violence, or a society that rewards the proximity to whiteness. It is not possible for me to be fully human as long as Black people are dehumanized. So co-liberation is saying, I move beyond recognizing that this system is flawed and my heart is with you. It's saying moving beyond allyship and understanding that white supremacy contributed to these things. And I know that I benefited, so I'm going to testify in every opportunity to identify with that privilege that I've now become conscious of. And co-conspirator and accomplice, which I believe most the world is at right now, is that I understand this. Let's get out there. Let's get on the front lines and let's tear up these systems together. But when you reach the level of co-liberation, you are saying that no matter who is present, no matter what movement is active in the moment, that I'm going to be actively tearing down these systems, because not only are you dehumanized, but if you are dehumanized, there is no potential way for me to be seen as fully human. I'll say more about that. There is a certain sort of, the system of white supremacy gets sustained because we have tapped into this notion that there is a such thing as privilege, right? So when we tap into the notion that there is a such thing as privilege, then that means that there's a such thing as underprivileged. If we tap into the notion that there's a such thing as superiority, then we tap into the notion that there's a such thing as inferiority, or there's a such thing as minority, right? And so we are still at a moment in history where we are lifting up the language and the identities that preface some people as superior and some people as inferior. And I personally believe that if we don't get to the point where we chop away at that false sense of hierarchy and superiority, then we'll never really systemically undo racism. Racism is upheld and white supremacy is upheld because that is the sort of notion that is weaved into the fabrics of our institutions, is weaved into law enforcement, is weaved into education, is weaved into housing, is weaved into our history that we're taught in schools, is weaved into how we see ourselves. And so if non-Black people and Black people are entering the world from a space that sees themselves as minorities, they will always see white people and people who identify with the proximity to whiteness as being superior. And it's nearly impossible to struggle against a system of white supremacy if you upheld psychologically that supremacy is valid. And so I know that is something that a lot of folks want to debate me on. I've often been debated on it. This is not an escape for tackling against the ways that certain people are prioritized within systems and treated better, or given housing opportunities, or not having to engage with law enforcement in violent ways. This is actually calling in non-Black folks to look deeper into who they are and systemically tie into an ancestry and a legacy of anti-racism. This means that when I ask non-Black people who their leaders are and who they look up to, that they can actually see themselves in the mirror and that they can identify with people that look like them, who have been struggling against racism, who have been trying to tackle white supremacy, who have tapped into this notion that anti-Black racism is tearing at the very fabric of our humanity. And so I think that in this moment, on a deeper level than I have ever experienced in my lifetime, we have an opportunity to reframe and reshape all narratives, not just to tackle and take down statues and symbolic gestures. We have an opportunity to flip white supremacy on its head and say that it does not exist, that there is no such thing as superior human beings, whether white or not. And the reason why I really want to continue to have these conversations with social workers who want to be in a social justice field is because Black bodies come into social work and a lot of times they are violated within those systems. And if we don't systemically tackle anti-Black racism within the school of social work, the field of social work, then social work becomes another form of policing our bodies, and it becomes another form of violence against Black bodies, particularly Black children. And so as we're on a global call for undoing, defunding, demilitarizing, and reimagining what policing could be, we also have to tune into the other structures that continue to uphold that infrastructure that prefaces some human beings as being more humane than others. And so I actually would like to open up this dialogue for the questions at this point, because I think that I've given you all a lot to think about, and I've probably turned some folks on their head about how they've been identifying with this work at this point. And this is the opportunity that I would like to air those grievances into the space and have a discussion about it.
Real quick, can you repeat the Grace Lee Boggs quote? People have been asking about it.
Yes, absolutely. Her quote is, "Do not get stuck in old ideas. If your ideas are stuck, they are already dead." So I'd like us to, before we open up the questions, go to my final slide. Which is the next slide. So when we tap into co-liberation, then we have an opportunity to undo systems, right? So the current movement for allyship, the current movement with accomplices has allowed for two things to happen. this looping cycle of injustice. I come out of Detroit. I come out of a city that is 80% Black. I come out of a city that is under mass surveillance, that is hyper criminalized, a city where community members are begging to be seen and not watched. And if I drive just 10 minutes away, I see a path toward justice. So the difference between policing in one neighborhood and surveillance in one neighborhood is I see well-lit streets and community members looking out for each other and being neighborly because there isn't the fear of one another hasn't been inundated within them psychologically. I see more community investment. I see more equity. I see livable wages and affordable water. If I go to my city, I see a lot of gentrification and devastation and poverty. Prior to COVID-19, Detroiters had a median income of $29,000 per year. During COVID-19, almost 50% of the residents of this city have lost their jobs. And so we're facing probably one of the greatest economic crises for the city of Detroit than we've ever faced, even probably greater than 2008. We're facing massive water shutoffs again at the height of a pandemic. The only reason why water was even turned on is because people got into the streets and started to contact legislators and city government and say, we're actually dying at 40% of the entire state, and you need to turn people's water back on. And so that is why this is a moment where allyship, where solidarity, where accomplices, where co-conspirators is just simply not going to be enough. We don't need folks vying for our humanity. We need folks to head off the systems that created this disparity in the first place. And so if you're in technology and you're innovating, ask why you're innovating. If facial recognition is something that's being touted by corporations, why does it exist and why is it being imposed upon cities where it's been proven to be racially biased, right? And so we're having to fight our livelihood against technology, against systems, against data, our data being extracted and leveraged and integrated in ways that further dehumanize us. And so this is an opportunity for folks in all aspects of life, in all fields of work, in academia, in other forms of education, in housing, in the water infrastructure institutions, and all institutions to ask, why now? What are we creating? Why are we creating it? And whose life is it going to impact? And so now I'm done, and I'd like to hear some questions.
Hi, Tawana. Thank you so much. I'll be presenting some questions that was gathered by the student org group here at the School of Social Work Common Roots. It's a collective of a lot of POC and student leaders and general student body members. And we all kind of worked together to create a list of questions that they were interested in asking you today.
Okay.
One of those questions that we have is, how may being anti-racist look like in the workplace and versus being organizing or at home?
You know, one of the things that keeps us in these institutions and keeps us in this looping cycle of injustice is fear. And so we have to get to the point where fearing a system that would continue to dehumanize us and continue to violate us and continue to essentially commit genocide on Black bodies becomes stronger. Our will to undo that system becomes stronger than our fear of losing a job. And so we have to start asking the questions that matter. We have to start challenging the systems from the inside, and we have to start paving a way for us to create meaningful work where our livelihood is valued instead of being stuck in jobs that dehumanize us on levels that are unseen most times. One of my comrades always says that there are a lot of folks suffering in quiet desperation. And I would argue a lot of that quiet desperation is happening on the jobs and in the job system. And so the more folks that rise up within systems, the stronger we are and the easier it is to undo those systems.
Thank you. And another question that kind of follows up to that is, how does data justice fit into being anti-racist in this kind of way as well?
Thanks for that question. I actually co-authored with the Actionable Institute for Social Policy a toolkit for centering racial equity within data integration, right? I mentioned that, all of us are connected to data systems. There are systems that's talking to each other every single day, and they're making decisions about our livelihood. They're making decisions about how we're hired, whether we're hired for a job. They're making a decision about whether we're able to live in a particular neighborhood. They're making a decision about whether we're able to drive or not drive, whether we're able to travel or not travel. And so I studied with the work group for over a year in creating this toolkit that can be leveraged by any institution that is sharing data and creating data to be thinking about racial equity at the forefront in not only their community engagement, but their implementation. And so I think racial equity is something that has to be prioritized no matter what system that you're engaged in. And I think that we've been able to consistently say that we're undoing racism without tackling anti-Black racism. Thank you, Amy. Happy to see you on a call. Amy is the one who actually convened all of us.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Tawana. Another question that was created by the API Coalition is, how do you suggest non-Black folks manage how they spend their time and energy in terms of doing this work on a micro, meso, and macro level? For example, how much time do we spend or should they spend engaging with folks in their family or fighting for this work within their schools and their employment places versus on social media and other platforms?
I understand that folks are not a monolith, right? And there is not one way or one route to doing this work. But I would say that whatever your passion is, that you need to tap into it and you need to go full force. If you reach the most people on social media by politicizing folks and offering up resources and tackling anti-racism in that sphere, then go ahead. But I would also take those lessons that I'm learning and try to figure out how to engage in those dialogues within your family and your institutions, right? And so I am of the mindset that you do have to make time to heal, to grieve, and to think and to tune in. But then you have to get back in the struggle, because if we're not going to consistently stay committed to the struggle, then we're going to keep struggling for our humanity. And I have to believe that most people in this world would like to live in the world that we have yet to create.
Thank you. That was so well put. I'm going to start opening up the questions from the audience. The first question that we have is from Matthew Schmidt. He says, I'm thankful for calling out the myth of white supremacy. My question is, how do we best refer to people who promote this idea violently? I'm guessing we shouldn't refer to them as white supremacists, but what then?
I think that the greatest fear that white supremacy has is the myth being unearthed. I think the greatest fear that white supremacy has is that it'll be flipped on its head. We're seeing a lot of violence be sparked in this country and in this world right now because folks are afraid that quote unquote minorities are going to rise up and realize they're not minorities. They're afraid that that this myth that's been indoctrinated into our educational systems and into our institutions of white superiority is going to be deconstructed and interrogated. And so the greatest thing that can happen is to stand up against that myth and say that actually, I don't see anything privileged and superior about being tied to a legacy of lynching and racial violence and police brutality. And so, yeah, it's a tough conversation because we've been hanging on to that for so long. We've been hanging on to this performative testimonial version of anti-racism for so long. We have been stuck on a racial seesaw that allows for Black people, and in many instances, other people of color, to be on one side of the seesaw and white people to be on the other side of the seesaw. And it kind of goes something like this. I acknowledge that I'm racist and I'm privileged. Well, I don't want to see your tears and hear your voice. Well, what should I then do to help you? And you know what that has gotten us, in some instances, a little far, but it hasn't systemically undone the systems. And so I think that we're going to have to get off that seesaw. We're going to have to undo the education that we've been given, and we're going to have to re-spirit all of the non-Black people in this world, and particularly Black people, into knowing that inferiority was never a thing, that white superiority was never a thing, that white supremacy is a myth that is being held up by institutions, and those institutions not only have to be done, but that narrative has to be undone.
Thank you, Tawana. Zoe Seinfeld asked the question, are you suggesting that unearned privilege is not a useful framework? How do you describe white people's place in systematic racism?
I would argue that white people aren't the only ones holding up systematic racism. That myth has made proximity to whiteness be just as violent as whiteness. And so we're living in a system where just until recently, a lot of non-Black folks were identifying on the census as white, right? A lot of folks have been figuring out how to pass as white in institutions, in organizations. The way that we talk, the way that we move, the way that we sometimes stand in the way of undoing racism systemically, is because of this myth and this notion that the American dream is still something to pursue. An American dream is another part of the myth of white supremacy. And it has more than just white people climbing that ladder. And most people die. Most people die and leave this earth having never, ever reached anywhere near what would be considered an American dream. And so we've stayed on this kind of hamster wheel of pursuit. And so if we're going to be thinking about undoing white supremacy, we have to be thinking about decolonization. We have to be thinking about all the ways we've internalized these systems, and all the ways that all of us have upheld a notion of anti-Black racism, and lifted up some racial demographics over others. And so this does not negate the work of challenging whiteness, but this brings more people into the debate of challenging and pushing back against anti-Blackness.
Emily Zonder has the question of, how do you have the conversations about experiences that are attached to whiteness without using the language privilege? What language do you use instead of talking about what is currently wide referred and recognized as white privilege?
Mm-hmm. I mean, if you want to have a discussion with folks about, what it means to be white, I would just say that, what brings you joy about being white? What is making you uphold that identity, right? And so, I mean, I'm not saying that we don't have those discussions, but I'm saying that if we continue to tell white people that they're privileged, then we have to continue to tell Black and brown people and Indigenous people that they're underprivileged. And I personally am not going to continue to live in a society where our young people are coming up and thinking psychologically that they're inferior, that they're minorities, that they're underprivileged, and that they don't have their full humanity at birth. So we have to move our dialogue to systemic undoing of white supremacy and anti-Black racism by making sure that, number one, we raise up our young people who are not white to know that they have their full dignity and humanity at the moment that they are born. And then we have to challenge those systems that would prevent them from reaching their greatest plateau. right? And so I think that sometimes we get stuck in wanting to feel a particular way. We want white people to testify to a particular thing. And honestly, that's just performative, and it makes you feel good in the moment, but it is not undoing the systems that are dehumanizing us. And it's not undoing anti-Black racism.
Thank you, Tawana. We had an anonymous person put something in our Q&A. It says, in collaboration, not needing Black people to lead me makes sense. But I'd like to hear more about tapped into that non-Black anti-racism and why that's so powerful.
Right. So think about there's so many moments in history. I think another way that the system of white supremacy has been held up and has been so tightly wound is that there is the same way that we've not been educated on our Black leaders in the way that we should have been. White people have not been fully educated on other whites, and other non-Black people have not been fully educated on other non-Black people who have struggled against the system of white supremacy, who have struggled against colonization, who have been abolitionists. And so this pursuit of only seeking out Black leaders means that when white people and non-Black people wake up in the mirror, they're not seeing themselves in the struggle. And we are at a point in history where we need everyone to see themselves in the struggle, to be able to lift up an image that looks like them, that has been systemically struggling against these systems. A very basic start would be the Rainbow Coalition, as an example, where there were many racial demographics that came together to tackle these systems. If that's just a basic start of finding someone that looks like you, that you can then tap into and carry their legacy forward and heighten that legacy and do your own work, then I think that would be great. But I think that if you can't look yourself in the mirror and see yourself in the struggle, and you have to rely on me to model it for you, then you're never going to be fully invested. You're always going to see it as my issue that you're supporting, and not yourself being tied up into undoing anti-Black racism and humanizing yourself, because this system has dehumanized you as well.
Another anonymous attendee submitted, do you think abolish the white race framework is helpful?
I think at some point we're going to get to a point where abolishing all of these identities that separates us will be relevant. But unfortunately, we're still at a time where some of us are still fighting for our full dignity and humanity. And so one of the things that keeps us from being, from falling into the we're all one human race identity is that some of us are still being treated and violently relegated to impoverished neighborhoods, being marginalized from systems, not having our livelihoods respected because of the color of our skin. And so I think once we can get to that point where we have completely undone the system of white supremacy, then we can kind of coexist in a way that means that I don't have to stand up and say, Black power, I'm Black and I'm proud, because you already know it. You're coming out the gate knowing it. The systems are, there are no systems that are dehumanizing me and making me feel inferior, or my children feel inferior, or there aren't law enforcement officers targeting my particular neighborhood because of my racial demographic. But I think that undoing the system of white supremacy and whiteness as an identity is absolutely an ultimate goal, because the other identities have had to respond to that identity. And as long as that identity is held up as superior, then there's always going to be this notion of inferiority and minority.
Thank you, Tawana. Anna Gersh has stated, can you say more about appropriate data use and collection? How can organizations that support Black people collect more useful data, better use data? Do you have a good example of any appropriate data use that's happening now?
Well, Yeah, I think so. I consider myself a data interventionist, so I'm always struggling with the notion of appropriate use of data, but understanding that right now that we've not been giving all the information that we need to undo these systems, so we still have to keep collecting information, right? And so I would use one example is the fact that we know that 40% of the state of the deaths of COVID-19 came out of Detroit in the entire state of Michigan. 40% of the deaths came out of one city. That information is important. That information is important to know because it shines a light on the drastic disparities that Detroiters have faced and Black bodies have faced in the state of Michigan. And it caused in folks that are outside of the city of Detroit to rethink how their systems and how their policies and how their other institutions are impacting the livelihood. Their health institutions, social work institutions, all institutions are impacting the livelihoods of Detroiters and of Black bodies in the state of Michigan. So that's one example where that data has given us a greater level of consciousness of how we are experiencing these violent systems. And that toolkit was put in the chat if that person can scroll up a little bit.
Maya Smith asks, how do we integrate in intersectional issues and the complexities of these identities within the struggle of creating new anti-racist systems? How can we not other people who exist at intersections of multiple identities while also centering their unique issues within that system?
I absolutely think that, and give it up to Kimberly Crenshaw, who is the Black woman who coined the term intersectionality. But I think that that is always significant. I mean, I enter the world at many intersections. I'm someone who suffers chronic illness. I'm a Black body. I'm a woman. And I have I'm a mother. I have various other identities that influence the way that I exist in the world. But I think that we should not be so quick to move away from the dialogue of undoing anti-Black racism to intersect all other ways that we can show up in this work. I think that work happens contemporaneously, absolutely, but I think that we have not stayed consistent with having the dialogue around anti-Black racism to the degree that we can take our attention off of that. I think that we're in a historic moment where the entire world is waking up to the defense of Black bodies, and this is an opportunity for us to dig deep on a level that we have never dug before. And so I'm not in a rush to move away from that dialogue at this point.
Richard Tolman asks, what does accountability look like for white folks who identify as co-liberators? If not, depending on Black leadership to act against white supremacy, is there a remaining responsibility to collaborate, coordinate, and accept feedback from Black leadership?
There's absolutely. I mean, I think that you can be in solidarity, you can be an ally, you can be an accomplice and a co-conspirator and move towards co-liberation contemporaneously. You know, at the same time, all of these things can be happening. But I absolutely think that if you can't wake up in the morning and look yourself in the mirror and see yourself connected and committed to undoing anti-Black racism without tapping into the already exhausted body of a Black person, then I would argue that you are not quite co-liberating. And that you are seeing yourself as disconnected from the struggle against white supremacy. You're seeing yourself as accompanying the struggle and not your humanity being tied to it. I will get the correct links.
Lindsay Johnson asks, as a school principal in Detroit, I'm interested to know your thoughts on a first step I can take to begin lifting up the focus on challenging the educational system from where I sit.
Ooh. The educational system is difficult. I've spent a lot of time in the last several years working with educators within the system. And I lift up Grace again, right? Grace Lee Boggs again, and say that, there's definitely a difference between schooling and education. And so a lot of times what we're dealing with is schooling, right? Similar to the job system versus meaningful work, right? And so there's got to become a point where within the educational system that we recognize that children are not a monolith, that folks come from various backgrounds, different educations, different home experiences, different identities, different abilities. And unfortunately, under the school system, it nurtures a sort of individualism and a sort of every person for themselves mentality that doesn't allow us to tap into our full humanity. A perfect example is the seating in most schools, right? And so you're looking at a moment where if a child is struggling in a classroom, they're most often punished. The person who wants to help them, the other child that wants to help them, is normally punished if they do so. They're criminalized, right? So if I see my peer not getting it and I lean over to help my peer, that is something that is often seen as a negative versus a village mentality. So we start in the school system of saying, like, you don't worry about that person, you just try to excel, and that person's failure is their responsibility. And that is something that is nurtured in classrooms all across the world. And so I would say that we can start with undoing that system and not making kids compete with one another and only think about themselves and how they excel within these systems. We should be encouraging young people to share their knowledge, to share their tactics, to teach one another how to understand the curriculum, to navigate the front lines of the system, because children are the front lines of the system. And so I would say that that's a start. Like, push some of those desks together. Let some of those kids study together. If a person is learning how to learn on a test because the person next to them is sharing their information and resources, that's a good thing. That's actually not a negative. And so we have to have this more of a train the trainer, educate one another mentality within the classroom. And at this point, we just don't have enough of that. And I would also argue, I see someone put STEM in the link, and I think that that's great, but I would say that STEAM is also something that we push for, is making sure that art is valued just as much as those other science, technology, engineering, and math. And so STEAM is something that we're pushing for folks to internalize, that the artist in your classroom is not acting out. They want to create a world that the classroom is not giving them.
Thank you, Tawana. Anonymous attendee submitted the question. Can you speak to compromise in political and action versus non-compromising anti-Black racism work?
Repeat the question, I'm sorry.
Yep. Can you speak to compromise in political and action versus non-compromising anti-Black racism work?
I'm going to try to answer this question. I'm not fully sure I fully understand the question, but I'm going to say non-compromising anti-Black racist work. I'm going to be honest. I'm going to be human and say I don't fully understand that question.
Okay, we can move on. Finn Bell asks, could you speak to all about your thoughts on efforts for white people to address their own racial trauma that comes from the colonization that their ancestors experienced when they went to perpetuate it on other people?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you're seeing a lot of white people rise up all over the world because they've been othered too, right? So this notion of white superiority and this notion of white supremacy, a lot of white folks can't live up to that. They can't live up to what society is telling white people that they are. If you're struggling and you're making minimum wage or not a livable wage, or you live in a impoverished white neighborhood and you're barely able to feed your children, or your academic system is violent, or you don't have access to the internet because you live in a rural area, you're challenging and asking questions too. And unfortunately, sometimes because the notion of white superiority and white supremacy is so strong, some folks react violently and out of fear, because they think that the reason why they didn't reach that white superiority is because there are other racial demographics standing in the way. Not that it's an actual myth and doesn't exist, but that there are other racial demographics that they have to conquer in order to get to that level of superiority that they were promised that they have. And so I think that what's going to happen is that, and what is happening, is that we're at a reckoning in this country and across the world where folks are going to have to pick a side. They're going to have to either say, I'm going to double down on this notion that whiteness is superior and white supremacy is the system that needs to be upheld. And that's going to bring all the ugliness that I have in legacy and generations out. Or they're going to have to pick a side that says, I'm going to be co-liberatory. When I look in the mirror, I'm going to tap into abolitionists, and I'm going to tap into people who stood on the front lines to undo slavery and undo racial violence and integrate systems and these sorts of things. And they're going to stand firm on that side. There is no more middle ground. There is no more options to opt in and opt out of the struggle if we're going to systemically undo the system. And so I would say start there. Be able to look yourself in the mirror, be able to tap into a legacy and a history. Do your research beyond Black leaders and find somebody that looks like you, that is part of history because they exist and they don't want us to know that they exist. And you find that and you model that and you build on that and you co-create with that image so that you can stand and be firm in co-liberation and not slip back into solidarity.
Aya Waller B asks, how might we respond to the questions, why now? What about George Floyd's murder that has been gallivanting around the world? That does not re-traumatize Black folks.
Black folks have been traumatized in this country since we got here, every day, whether it's conscious or unconscious. George Floyd's murder was the Emmett Till of our day, right? And so there's something about that body being brutalized in that way for all of us to see for such a sustained period is one of the reasons why Emmett Till's mother wanted his casket open, right? She wanted the world to understand how violent this system is and how it would brutalize a child in order to uphold this notion of white superiority. And so George Floyd's murder and the time and the patience that this white racist person took when they kneeled for 8 minutes and 46 seconds on his neck, even beyond his death, while we watched the lights go out in his eyes and a teenager plead for his humanity, a teenager who held that camera, the courageousness of that teenager to hold that camera and to let the world see how violent this system can be. It was our opportunity to tap into all of those inspiring co-liberators who have been stuck in allyship for so long and not felt like it's been enough to get up and say no more. And so I think that this moment is a cultivation of folks who have been entering this point of trying to figure out how to not have to live up to white supremacy when they don't believe in it, to not have to keep testifying to privilege when they don't believe in it, and to tap into a certain type of humanity that would say that if you are dead and dying on the streets, then I am dead and dying inside. And so I just think that this is a new moment. I think that Grace Boggs would also say that I don't know what the next American Revolution looks like, but we might be able to imagine it if our imaginations were rich enough. And I think that we're at an opportunity where we could actually be imagining what the next American Revolution looks like. And we can create a society that doesn't preface one demographic over another. And we can take down any institution that stands in the way of our fullest humanity, not just in name, but in fabric and in policy, and in our theory, psychologically.
An anonymous attendee submitted this question. You mentioned students being a part of the collective and teaching and supporting the classroom. Do you feel that that leads to a burden on Black students if the same strategy is used for PWIs? For example, should Black social work students be a part of teaching white social work students in the classroom?
You know, that's always a complicated question, right? I talk to a lot of my comrades who often say, you know, it's not my responsibility to teach white people to be anti-racist. I have a different mindset when it comes to that. And people should show up the way that they feel most comfortable in this moment. But I would argue that there's no one in the world who can teach me how I need to be treated better than me. When I go into any institution, if I don't like how I'm being served, I'm very clear and I'm very vocal about it. If I'm in a relationship and I don't like the way I'm being treated, I'm very clear and I'm very vocal about it. I don't see undoing racism as any different. If I want to be treated with my fullest dignity and humanity, I'm going to tell anybody who's not doing it how to do it. And so that takes a lot of patience. It means that you have to move beyond being triggered by words. And that can be complicated because there are systems that line up to convince people that their words are more significant and that they matter more than yours. But I would say that we have to stick in this fight. And I am very cognizant of our mental health in being a part of this work. And I say we tune into one another, tap into our cadres of, Black bodies so that we can get whole again. And then we get back out there and we show folks the way we deserve to be treated. There's always going to be this myth of, if we just dress better and if we just act better and if we just talk better, and I'm using better loosely. But Dr. King was assassinated in a suit. Malcolm X was assassinated in a suit. Medgar Evers was assassinated in a suit. So many of our leaders were assassinated in well-dressed clothing. And so it's not a matter of teaching us how to tap into the proximity of whiteness or act a certain way or talk a certain way or dress a certain way. But it is a matter of saying, like, your image of superiority is false. White supremacy is a myth. You've been miseducated just like I have. And if you want to learn about how to undo these systems of white supremacy and tap into your fullest humanity, then I have time for you. If you want to keep uplifting this identity of privilege and superiority and this notion that Black folks and brown folks and indigenous folks are inferior and minorities, then I don't have that time for you. And so that's what I would argue. And I would, refer them to look at the ancestors and the elders who look like them, who have done that work or who are trying to do that work, and build on that. So it's not just a matter of only learning from Black people and other people of color. It's a matter of finding the folks that look like you, other white folks who are part of that history, because they do exist.
Perry asks, as a social worker starting community programs in Detroit, how can we best root our programming and structure in an anti-racist movement? We're attempting to do work with a diverse community of Detroit, and I would appreciate that your advice on this.
Yeah, so say that question one more time for me, please.
As a social worker starting community programs in Detroit, how can we best root our programming and structure in anti-racist movements?
First of all, you have to ask yourself, why Detroit? A lot of people don't ask themselves that very basic question. or even know what the complications of being in a predominantly Black city is, what resources you're not going to be given just because you're in a predominantly Black city, what types of trauma are the Black people that you're going to be serving coming to you with, what's happening in the institutions that are supposed to serve them prior to you getting there, that is preventing them from being able to reach their full humanity. And it's also kind of decolonizing the thinking of showing up in spaces to fix the people there versus the systems that would create the need for social work in the first place. And so I think that there's a lot of questions, that we have to ask about why we show up in the work, why programs are created, who are the folks that we're going to be serving, and why they're in the predicament that they might be in that will require our services. And we have to take the leadership from those folks about how, what they need. And it's difficult because a lot of time we're coming in with like curriculum and, and the lessons that we've learned, but the real lessons are not going to happen until you engage with the folks that are on the ground experiencing the systems and who need the support. And so there is no real, there's no super formula for that. It's going to have to be an evolving response based on what you learn on the ground.
Paul Harding asks, a lot of the anti-racist material that they've engaging with uses statistics like incarceration rates or health outcomes as evidence of white supremacy structures. What roles do these indicators have in the new pyramid that you've been describing throughout your presentation?
Yeah, so, all those systems have to go. And we're seeing a move, we're seeing a global movement to undo that. But, unfortunately, that's going to be probably a slower process than many of us would like. But in the interim, we have to be visioning alternative systems to that, right? So I'll use an example in Detroit is Project Greenlight. Project Greenlight is a mass surveillance system with flashing green lights that flash 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they tie into a real-time crime center that is monitored by police 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and some officers even have it connected to mobile devices, right? Well, we are thinking of a project called Green Chairs, Not Green Lights, where we're actually asking community members to come back to the front porches, to come back to the window, right? So the purpose of a Project Greenlight is because people want to feel safe, right? They think that mass surveilling everyone around them is somehow going to prevent crime. We know statistically that it does not. But what we do know that prevents crime is a village, is neighbors looking out for one another. It's community members watching that child walk to school. It's folks, to ensure that there isn't such thing as trafficking happening in the first place, so that we're then not tapping into our surveillance cameras to hope that we can find someone who's committed harm in our community. We know that making sure that everyone has affordable water might reduce their opportunities to create quality of life crime. We know that folks don't break into gas stations and liquor stores to steal potato chips just because they don't have anything better to do. Folks are hungry. Folks are thirsty. Folks have been dehumanized by the system, and you don't respond to those systems with further criminalization and further mass incarceration and further militarization. You don't respond to those systems like that. You undo those systems and you reduce quality of life crime by taking care of people.
Hi, Tawana. I'm going to jump in. First, I want to thank you for this rich conversation and for answering so many of these questions, which are they've been fantastic. You've talked a lot about the use of language and how language, has meaning and it has an impact on people and their feelings of self-worth, from, social constructions of racial categories to classifying some people as oppressed and other people as privileged. we have a few questions about the language that you use around a co-liberator and an ally. And one question from Amisha Tutwiler is, she writes, I understand the concept of co-liberation, but what does an ally progressing towards co-liberation look like in action on a daily basis? What does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Would you mind going back to the slide where I break it down? That one, the next one. Yes. So I want to have this visual up because it shows you how far away allyship is from co-liberation, right? And that is that's not a negative, right? We've been kind of stuck in allyship for a pretty long time, but it looks like denouncing this notion of superiority. And that is what is most difficult for folks to do. What happens within allyship is a consistent testimonial of privilege. So you have folks who really stop at it being enough that they've acknowledged that these systems are violent and that they have somehow benefited from these systems. And allyship is moving beyond that. It's actually saying that I actually don't feel good about being tied to this legacy. And I understand that this legacy is false. And in order for me to tap into a different legacy, I'm going to start to do the work of not only becoming an accomplice in deconstructing these systems and challenging these systems, but I'm actually going to study how I become a co-liberator by looking into the ancestry and the legacy of folks who look like me who have been doing this work. And so it's not me, it moves you beyond, I'm only going to be able to jump in and opt in if there's someone Black available to lead me. And so it looks like starting this due to study. I'm a big proponent of political education and study and knowing our history, and not just the history we're fed, but seeking out the information that we're not being told, because that is what has kept us stagnant for so long.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. So it's really about not just moving beyond just acknowledging that you've been privileged and acknowledging that you've benefited from these systems, to being okay with following Black leadership and joining the movement to overthrow these systems.
But then moving a step beyond that and saying, I'm going to be undoing a system, whether there's a Black person there to lead me or not. You know what I'm saying? And it's going to say that, you know, I come from a legacy that's not just violent racist. I come from a legacy that's not just folks who lynch people. I come from a legacy that's not just white people who enslave people. There were other white people in history that I wasn't taught on purpose, and I need to find out who they are.
That's great. So we've had several questions and several people who have been asking, do they have permission to share your slides?
Yeah, absolutely.
Obviously, we're giving you credit.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. So we have an anonymous attendee who's also been asking, how do we keep our young adults motivated? Because right now, you know, this is a moment where there's a lot of just action. People are protesting, they're listening. How do we sustain this momentum? How do we keep it going so it's not just something that's trending on social media, something that's in our 24-hour news cycle, but it becomes a part of our everyday life? And specifically, how do we keep those young people involved in this?
And you know, and I'm assuming you're talking about, are you talking about your non-Black people, right? Mostly, right?
It doesn't specify, but yeah, I think that this specifically with non-Black people, how do we keep people involved and motivated?
Yeah, I'm going to keep saying that unless a person sees their skin in the game, it's going to be an optional thing. I'm going to keep reiterating the significance of teaching young people that there were folks before them that were engaged in this work that looked like them. That has worked since the beginning of time for any child. is, you know, if you think yourself a superhero, you're going to do superhero things. If you think that your only legacy is racism and your only legacy is upholding white supremacy and your only legacy is colonization and your only legacy is racial violence, then you're going to be battle fatigued. And you're going to feel like there's nothing you can do to systemically undo the system, because the only folks who were good humans were people that didn't look like you. And I'm challenging at this point in our history for folks to start to see themselves as part of the struggle, because there is a legacy of that.
That's great. So in order to keep the momentum going, people need to connect their motivation with their history, and they kind of need to look into their own history and find models of people who, let's say you're a white person, who has done this work, who has held this torch and this fight for equity.
Right. I mean, you know, I'm blanking on her name, Viola Louisa,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
As an example of being someone who died in the struggle for against anti-Black racism, right? And so there hasn't been enough work done, of course, clearly, but there's been a lot of work done and a lot of ground laid for folks that are not Black to tune into. And this doesn't mean you supersede the voices of Black people. This means that you're just able to wake up and look yourself in the mirror and see that you're connected to a legacy larger than violence. And I think that that is the only way that folks will stay in the struggle and find themselves, their liberation tied up in it, because they see themselves connected to the history of undoing these systems. And I you know, when I talk to a lot of non-Black people who are really wanting to be, who really want to move beyond allyship, who really want to be connected to this struggle, one thing that I notice all the time is that they don't know anybody that was committed to the struggle that looks like them. They don't know of anybody. And I think that that's a disservice, not only to the ongoing long struggle of co-liberation, it's a disservice to Black people to always have to model that. It is a disservice. We know how we want to be treated, and I think that we should tell you, but I also think that when we're not around, you should still be seeking, and that you should be able to look yourself in the mirror and see yourself as part of the struggle, whether or not we're engaged with you or not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great. So find your role model and rewrite your own history. And for Black people, that's rewriting the history. So it's not just a history of violence and of lynching, but of being like freedom fighters, to find those role models. So speaking of that, there's a question, anonymous attendee. So Tawana, how do you address Black people who have detached from the struggle, who don't believe that they are systematically dehumanized, and rather they blame individual behaviors?
Well, I would say that it's probably a form of escapism, right? So if from the moment we entered these shores, everything about us said that you're not going to be about anything. I'll use growing up in Detroit as an example. I learned my entire childhood, and even through institutions where I was schooled, that I had to get up and get out of here. That Detroit wasn't somewhere that I could be vibrant, that I could grow and thrive, that I could make meaning of my life. And people survive that type of narrative and indoctrination in many ways. And sometimes, unfortunately, the notion that whiteness is superior makes people pursue a proximity to it. And so I deal with that the same way that I deal with talking about anti-Black racism on any level. That internalization of the system of white supremacy does not leave us unaffected. And so I use of course I'm talking to my people and my family, so that dialogue is different. But I would say that the same systems that have dehumanized all of us have show up in different ways when it comes to Blackness. And I'm constantly engaged in those dialogues about how turning our eye on the least of these and the ones who are suffering the most is not going to liberate us from these systems, and that all Black lives matter, no matter what, how they're showing up in society. And Detroit is something that I have to consistently engage in that dialogue, because we have suffered under the weight of a half century of propaganda assault. And the world has seen us in one particular way for my entire life. And so I'm constantly having to engage people of all racial demographics about our humanity. And so that is a dialogue that I'm engaged in on every level all the time. And I had to do it for myself, because I was miseducated about what it meant to grow up in a Black city. And I had to do the work myself to bring myself out of that. And I engaged with a lot of elders and ancestors, the same way I'm telling white people and non-Black people to do, I had to do for myself, and study the history of folks who had pride in Detroit, and who fought for Detroit, and who understood the value in the Black bodies in Detroit. And so that is what I model now, because I stand on shoulders who did it before me.
That's great. Thank you, Tawana. I want to mention Christina DeRuis has requested that we go to the next slide where there's the diagram. So Fatima, can you head over to the next slide? And we're going to have about 1 or 2 more questions. I'm sorry that we were not able to get to all of these. And this recording will be made available on our website, which we'll put in the chat. So one that we just had is, how do we support Tawana's amazing work financially when we share it? If you have information about that, Tawana, if you could share that with us, we can also add that to the chat and make sure it goes out to our participants.
Yeah, I mean, you could get the book, Towards Humanity, on sites, Barnes and Nobles. It's on other, it's on that other site too, but it's on many sites, Towards Humanity, Shifting the Culture of Anti-Racism Organizing. And I'd love to continue this dialogue. Like I said, that was an olive branch. That was me reaching out to have this discussion. And I'm working on the expanded edition of this book now. And I hope to have it out by the end of the year. And I would love to root it in a lot of what I'm learning from being in discussion with all of you about the next levels of co-liberation.
Okay, awesome. We'll send that information out in the chat as well. I want to end on a question that was by an anonymous attendee about, what does co-liberation look like for non-Black MSW students within a school of social work and non-Black social workers within the profession of social work? And I want to even add to that question and say, how do non-Black people change institutions in which there's power and there's privilege? I think we can all relate to that, whether or not you're a social worker or you're in your job or, you're in your company. How do we shift cultural institutions so that they are no longer practicing with anti-Blackness?
I would definitely say start with that toolkit. And I'm not just lifting that up because we spent a great deal of time on it, but social work is a system that's integrated with a lot of data about people. And a lot of decisions that are made about their livelihoods are made based on that data that's been compiled and that analysis that has been made. And so I would start with, I would use that toolkit probably immediately. But in addition to that, I would, you challenge the dominant negative narratives that often follow behind Black children and Black people, and start to ask those deeper questions about how folks got to engage with the system in the first place. I don't see enough of those questions being asked. I don't see those questions being asked deeply enough in technology. I find ourselves often fighting against the systems that are being lifted up to support and represent us. And there are not enough folks who are at the innovation stage that are asking those deeper questions and saying why are we creating this? Why does the system exist? Why is this the policy and model that we're following? What impact has this policy and model had on the humans that we interact with? And so I would say this is an opportunity to deepen the questions and to try to vision, if those questions come up with answers that say, actually, we don't really have an analysis of how we've impacted Black bodies, as an example, then I would say that you need to revisit those policies and procedures. And this is an awesome opportunity to do that. I know that particularly in Detroit, and I'll wrap this up, but like during a water crisis, if your water is turned off, your children can be taken, right? And I met with social workers who told me to my face that they hid files, that they decided that they were not going to take the children of Black people's children during a water crisis. And so you're gonna have to make some brave steps to intervene in systems that are dehumanizing people, but being lifted up as safety.
That's great. So we're going to wrap up the question and answer period. We apologize that we could not get to all these questions, but the ones we did, and Tawana, all the information, the wisdom that you shared, we want to thank you for it. It's healing.
Thank you so much.
It's healing and it's needed. And, I think that your emphasis on we all need to kind of reconnect with our own ancestors, find those models of people who fought this fight, and we just need to keep moving forward. It's healing and it's beneficial.
Thank you, Aisha. And can I just quickly say the looping cycle of injustice came out of years worth of work with our data bodies, which I'm a part of the co-lead team for. And that was an analysis that came out of years of work with Detroit, LA, and Charlotte, and community members saying that they felt like they were caught up in this looping cycle of injustice that they just could not get out of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, really making sure that all of us kind of understand that we've all been negatively harmed and impacted by white supremacy, non-Blacks and Blacks, I think is key. So I want to thank you for sharing that with us. Fatima, if you could advance to the next slide or a few slides over, I think we also have Tawana's Twitter information, and then we are going to wrap up. So Combs a Poet, great handle, Tawana, who is a poet.
I'm going to retire as a poet very, very soon, I hope, when we undo all of this.
Yeah, still a lot of work to be done. So definitely give her a follow. And now I am going to hand it back over to Trina, who's going to just talk about some general reminders about the Engaged team and who we are going to have on next week. And Tawana, I want to thank you again. This was healing and it was great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you so much, Tawana. We appreciate you taking time and all of the work that you've been doing and will continue to do, I'm sure. Throughout the chat, we've been asked, will this be posted? Will these resources be shared? So we have all our past virtual conversations at this link, which we put in the chat. For those who are doing this for field education credit, there's a volunteer opportunity list, and you can get field credit for this talk as well as continuing education credits. If you just do this volunteer form and get in touch with your School of Social Work educator, field educator. Next slide, please. So we have another session coming up next week. And it's going to be talking about equity in clinical practice. And so we're going to talk a lot about telehealth and how to improve clinical practice in this COVID-19 environment. So please join us for that. But we will be sending out, we hope to send out to everybody who participated links to this recording so you can continue this conversation moving forward. So thank you very much and have a great rest of the afternoon.